Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to a very rare early afternoon show. So many of you people, especially those of you across the pond in either England or Australia, have asked me to do live shows at a time that makes it more convenient for you to catch a live broadcast. So we have a guest today who is from across the pond. So I thought this would be a good opportunity, and I apologize for our late start. We're having some technical issues, but I think we've got them sorted out. So we're just going to begin now. So recently, there has been a resurgence in interest in searching for extraterrestrial life. And unlike some of the decades-old efforts like SETI, or the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which focuses solely on radio waves, which I've always thought was a little strange, because there's a lot of assumptions being made by SETI that a technologically advanced intelligent species would somehow develop the very same communications technology that we have. And I think that's a bit presumptuous and maybe foolish, because after all, an alien species may never develop radio, may develop something better or different. Maybe they communicate through lasers or light or other means of communication not involving radio. But recently, there has been many efforts, most famously perhaps Avi Loeb's project, looking for signs of alien or intelligent life in other ways. And one of the people sort of in the underground has been doing this for quite some time, is my guest today, Bruce Fenton. So without any further ado, we're just going to bring him in here and begin. 1 second. Oh, there we go. Welcome, Bruce. I'm glad that you made it.
Hi, Stephen. Yeah, thank you very much for having me back on.
Yeah. You have been a guest. Yeah, internet issues. You haven't been a guest on this show. You were a guest on my previous show, which was an audio podcast, The Midnight Hour, and we had a great conversation about these things. But so much has changed that I wanted to bring you back. And I thought we could begin and really just, if we could, I know a little bit more about your history and things like that, but for the benefit of my audience, what is it that got you so interested in this sort of different, I would call it a different search for extraterrestrial intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say that I've had an interest in, I guess, technology, futurism, and the possibility of something else out there since a very early age. And I mean, I've got a sort of tech background. I studied IT and stuff in university and stuff. I think sort of some crossovers there. And so, yeah, also, though, I was always interested in the ancient mysteries and anything that was on the fringes, even, anything where science couldn't quite fathom, was it real, was it not real, whether it's the paranormal, whether that's, some of the mysteries of the past, how pyramids were built, all of these questions. And I can't tell you for sure why that was, but I was one of those people that's driven by the unanswered questions and topics that are no-go and considered either taboo or very strange. So I guess I've problems in my life because those topics tend to bring you into conflicts with people, and also to
just a little bit, yeah.
You've probably seen that a little bit, that they are fields with a lot of emotions, because when you don't have a lot of evidence perhaps for something, then you can run on beliefs, emotions, personal convictions, and as we all know, those areas are very sensitive. Unlike science, where you're debating evidence, when you're dealing with people's feelings and their vested interests and emotions, it gets quite volatile. But anyway, we'll get to that. I know, Steve, because you tackle that a lot anyway. Everyone on your show knows that there's problems in these fields, right? But for me, it stemmed from that. So I've looked into mostly ancient mysteries in the past, and then that's kind of pivoted a bit more towards the alien and UFO kind of crossover topics, although with more of a focus on the hunt for alien intelligence more than UFOs specifically. And again, we can get into where I see the differences in those topics. And then a few years ago, I kind of stumbled across an account with someone claiming that they had had a contact with an artifact, and that this artifact had given them information about a contact event in the past, that possibly there'd been a visitation. And that led to a project to see whether that was true, basically, to analyze what data had come out of their account, this anecdote, and to see whether or not possibly that they'd stumbled on some kind of artifact of an alien civilization. So it's a kind of a wild backstory. I'll go into that a little bit later, but that's kind of a very quick snapshot of my personal journey, through these topics over the last, well, I think 25 years now of kind of exploring the fringes, with a view, I think, now to looking at more of the science and less of just the anecdotes and, enjoying the stories and all that. I think that, we have to be able to find some support for some of these claims that are out there, or dismiss those claims, right? There's a point where you have to start sieving through and decide, is there anything to this entire field of alien contact, alien visitation, alien intelligence out there in space? Whichever one of those you're interested in, you want to see that there's some kind of evidential support, or kind of move on with your life and leave it behind if there isn't.
Yeah, I often wonder, like, what I would do with all the time that I have invested into this kind of stuff. If I wasn't doing this, right. Time is our most precious resource, and sometimes I feel like I've wasted so much of my time because there's so many dead ends and disappointments, and the chasing the carrot constantly, and then you get disappointed again. But I wanted to ask you, because we've never really talked about this. As a child, when I first heard about SETI, I was intensely interested. But as I grew a little bit older and a little wiser and knew a little bit more about science, I thought, I think Stanton Friedman called it SETI the silly effort to investigate, because they're making all these assumptions, like, well, if they're intelligent, they've developed radio. Like, this doesn't make sense to me that the greatest effort to search for, or the most well-known, at least, effort to search for extraterrestrial intelligence is centered around, let's look for radio signals. What have you thought of the, and by the way, I think some of those people are good, well-intentioned people, but I think it's a little misguided. So I've never asked you, like, what do you think of the whole SETI effort, and what are they doing right? What are they doing wrong? And what should they be doing differently? Because there's a lot of people with new ideas about this topic, searching for extraterrestrial intelligence right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're in a time of flux. But if you look at the kind of the origins of the SETI Institute and the beginnings of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, they were seen as very fringe, almost as fringe as the UFO people are now. And most of the academic world just thought that this was, silliness, and that you're going off hunting, telephone calls from little green men, and, what a waste. And in fact, it didn't take very long for government funding to be axed from that topic, and under the same.
Yeah, I always forget that. People forget that they started out as a government-funded group, and then the funding got pulled real fast. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the senators, I think it was, gave a presentation basically saying, why are we giving money to this silly search for little green men, and what a waste. And yeah, it got pulled. So for a very long time, the SETI Institute had been pretty much the only focal point of this search, and they got their money from private interest. That there was billionaires or whoever would say, give them a little bit of money to build a telescope. Say a little bit, obviously, if you're very rich, it's a little bit. So they would get
a couple million, yeah.
Right, for you and I, it's not a little bit. So they would get, let's say, significant donations from wealthy people, so they could build telescopes, and they had other ways of fundraising. But so the governments have basically been out of the alien hunting topic for decades, and so there's just been this kind of private effort through the SETI Institute. Now, when they began, they had to kind of figure out, how are you going to go about looking for any signs of intelligence, and based on the technologies they had, it was somewhat limited. So they went with what they understood at the time, is that advanced civilizations like ours, if you consider ours advanced, use radio technologies for communication, and also are emitting radio waves into space accidentally through leakage from just how we communicate on Earth, how we send TV and all the rest. Right. So all our broadcasts were leaking out into space. So they took the kind of hypothesis that there would be other civilizations that would have this kind of leakage. And on top of that, that there might be active METI kind of efforts, these kind of directed messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, METI. So there might be METI efforts on other planets that were sending out directed beams, you know, of kind of hello, we're out there type messages. And that if they built enough of these large receivers that were covering enough, you know, the spectrum, that they might be able to pick up something from, you know, a neighbor somewhere. So that was kind of the view. So it was kind of a technological limitation, and it's also based on, you know, knowing what you know at the time. That's what you would do. But then obviously this is decades ago and things have changed, and that's why there's a lot of people out there now in the kind of the wider SETI field rather than the SETI Institute. And just to clarify, some people say SETI and they just assume you're talking about the SETI Institute. But obviously SETI is just the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. So there's other independent efforts now that are nothing to do with the Institute, right? So in that wider field, there are people who are saying, hey, hang on a minute, you know, radio waves probably aren't the way to go, that we have major issues. For example, let's say there is another civilization out there somewhere in the cosmos and it's using radio waves, right? The chances of its radio waves heading in our direction, right, first of all, is minuscule. You know, you think of your infinite points in space, or infinite directions for this signal to be traveling for its main focal point, right? And then on top of that, it has to be traveling towards us at the time where we've built these receivers. Yeah. And so now when you think about the number of stars, and you know, even if you say that there's, you know, quite a few civilizations out there, you know, the locations are going to be so randomized out there, you know, where these civilizations might be, that first of all, the chances of them being near is low. The chances of those beams heading our way and within a time where they haven't broken up over the distance, and that we are listening in the right direction at the right moment, you know, you get to this minuscule chance. It's absolutely, you know, like a needle in an ocean of needles, you know, that's just vast. And the chances that it's going to end up with us detecting that signal, you know. So I think you're approaching close to a 0% chance, you know, when you really sort of do the math on this. And there's like leading scientists who are saying the same thing. It's not just like my opinion. You're saying that this chance is so tiny as to think that they don't believe we will ever pick up one of these radio signals, even if they're out there. They don't believe that, right? So that's why we're seeing now a kind of a transition away from radio waves, at least in the newer projects, that people realize that what we need to do is kind of compile lists of other techno signatures, which are signatures of technologies that go beyond radio waves. And so this is something that, I mean, the SETI Institute are obviously aware of this, and they are doing other things. They're starting to do work with looking for changes in the atmospheres of other planets, you know, moving more into the looking to see if there's any, you know, organisms that produce gases. So we get this kind of the new exploration of exoplanets through looking for diffraction in the atmospheres that would suggest that there's particular gases, you know, that might be linked to industry. So they are kind of getting into that as well. And there's other projects separate again from this, the SETI Institute, doing the same thing. So we've got an expanding search where we realize that you can't limit yourself to radio waves. And I think there's Paul Davies, who's a kind of a leading thinker in the astrophysics field, has kind of said that, you know, he really doesn't think that we will ever find life through radio waves, and that, you know, suggests that we look for things like chopped up meteorites so that they've been modified, or look for bioengineering of an organism that may have been, you know, altered by some technology, and just, you know, really expanding this field out for all sorts of other, you know, signatures of an alien race. And so that's kind of what's happening. So I think, yeah, they did a good, let's be honest, they opened up a field and they began that journey. But I think that what they've really achieved is merely just the foundation for real science to be done. And that unfortunately the methods they were using were just not realistic. It was not realistic that we were going to pick up this signal, you know, ET saying hello. And I think that now, if you were to sort of survey scientists in the field, I bet most of them don't believe the first confirmation of an alien technology, you know, will come through radio waves, that they will expect it to be through something, you know, more along some probes, megastructures, like say bioengineering,
Dyson
mining on something like
spheres.
that.
Yeah. Some
Right. It's going to be,
more solid than. Yeah, I always thought, and also Brian Dunning did this documentary where he talks about the unlikelihood of reaching or realizing there's another technological intelligent civilization like flashing light bulbs on a Christmas tree. There has to it's like completely, it's just so improbable, because we also have to realize that civilizations like ours may develop nuclear technology and destroy themselves. So there may be a short window in which that technological civilization exists and can communicate with radio waves at all before they destroy themselves, or they could have a pandemic, a global pandemic, and kill everybody on their planet, and their civilization would be gone. So interesting that at least I think that's progress, that people are changing their, the focus for a while seemed to be on just this one effort, which seems kind of dumb to me. I'd rather look for it everywhere. Like, let's look for signs that maybe some intelligent species besides our own has visited planets in our solar system, some kind of artifacts. And you mentioned this artifact. I wanted to get into that. So you got down a rabbit hole of somebody claiming to have sort of access to an alien artifact. Let's unpack that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I was going to let you know after some other stuff, but yeah, we'll do that quickly as well, because it is such a big thing. Just I can't, ask you to skip over to that and then come back. So I'll give you a bit of an sorry, my phone. I'll give you a bit of an outlay on that, and then tackle a couple of the issues. But just very quickly respond to what you said there, that it's the great filter hypothesis. Yeah, the idea that civilizations reach a certain point and then they destroy themselves. And we're starting to better understand that now, because if you look at the technologies we're producing, so let's take, say, nanotech, biotech, AI, just those three alone are all existential threats to our civilization, right? So you can utilize biotech in such a way that you make a small mistake and you end up eradicating life on Earth, whether through engineering a virus, or through re-engineering the genome of your species, and that trait gets passed on and ends up being fatal for your species. You could release, an AI to run your planet, and the AI goes, cranky, decides to and and of course nanotech, the idea of the grey goo idea, that that the nanotech goes kind of goes wild and starts converting everything into grey goo, and your whole planet is destroyed. So all these technologies, although they potentially can benefit us and help us move into space, they could also destroy us. So we realized that other advanced civilizations would have reached this kind of great filter where their own technologies become so dangerous that it's unlikely to survive, and that it may be that most civilizations do not pass through the filter, which would mean that even if there was loads and loads of inhabited planets, that very few would get to the point where they have like an active space program, or certainly to go out into space, sending probes, that they tend to collapse as they reach that high technology, right? And we can see how we're probably right on the edge, right, of that filter now.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to see that there's a lot of existential threats to humanity. One of them that really, I hate that it bothers me, but this biotechnology bothers me. I just think of Frankenstein. Like, there's some things you shouldn't mess with. And I think viruses is one of them. Like, you don't want to be doing gain of function research on anything. That's just, to me, it's irresponsible. And it's like, it's just playing with fire, I mean, if the dials of the last major health event were turned just a little bit worse, it could have been really, really bad, and yet these biotech companies, they haven't stopped or slowed down. It's just, well, we can't do gain of function in this country, so we'll do it over in this country now. They just change where they do it.
Yeah, people can now basically do genetic engineering at home. So the genie is right out the box. We're in trouble there, because you can't really control it. Certainly we're at the edge of where we're just about controlling it. So once you think that nearly anyone has access to the bit of money, has the potential to set up a genetic engineering lab in their shed, you can see how quickly that could lead to some pretty crazy people doing some crazy things, right? And then
I can
the same
imagine.
argument with AI, right? AI now is moving to the point where, say we have autonomous battle weapons, which we have, right? They're already building loads of those. That if you have someone who's able to hack those systems, who just hates humans, right, and says, yeah, time for the onslaught, and just sets the robots against us. These are real problems that are in the wings that people are talking about and saying, how do we avert this? Because we could just have these drones just flying around killing us all. And again, with the nuclear threat, which we used to be worried about, I don't know if it's even up there with some of these anymore, because potentially they are more lethal than a nuclear war. So yeah, this is a time where I think we are at the great filter. And so yeah, there's definitely a question there as to whether any civilizations make it, or let's say any significant percentage versus the vast size of the cosmos. How many civilizations that survived would be somewhere in the Milky Way and would be within a distance where their probes or signals could reach us. So there's this complexity to the topic that has to take into account behavior, technological progression, and other issues that it really does start to make you think about the figures involved in how many civilizations are probably out there, and our chances of contacting them. So all of these things are a part of the story. So moving on to your other question. So my personal work.
Yes, the artifact. This is so interesting to me, because I've always thought, if an intelligent, technologically advanced species has visited us in our distant past, there should be some signs of it. There should be some evidence of that here on Earth. And and I know there's ancient alien theory, but a lot of that is completely flawed and based on bad translations. But I'm still open to that possibility that there could be some artifacts or evidence of just such visitation. And you may have stumbled upon one of those things, right?
Right. That's my position on it. And just to preface that, if you were trying to find an alien civilization or evidence of it, let's say visitation. So you want to look for visitation to our solar system. Now, the chances of an alien race turning up just to the moment that we have our space age and that we have the technology to detect them and the AI to integrate to communicate, all of those things that we kind of have now, it'd be awfully convenient if out of all of the the vast epochs of time and the vastness of space, aliens turned up right now at just the right moment where we could kind of engage with them. And so this is an argument from the academics, is that people keep saying, aliens are here, blah, blah, but it's more likely from their view, with these infinitesimal odds, that aliens would turn up at this moment. You say, well, it's more likely that we're in a space age, therefore we're thinking about space. People have got the idea that we can go into space, so aliens must go to space, and it's become part of our culture, it's become memes, in our movies, and so that people are kind of primed to see what they think are alien ships, or primed to experience psychological states that make them think that they're dealing with aliens, and that's a much better answer when you look at the statistical chances of aliens turning up right now, right, versus infinite time and space, which is totally true. It's totally accurate to say that, right? But, and this is where you'll find most scientists will be a bit more open-minded. They say, well, hang on. Now, if you expand that vastness of time and say, well, could an alien civilization have visited the solar system any time in the last 4 billion years? Well, 4 billion years is a much better sample set than, say, the last 100
That's
years.
a long time, yeah.
Right. So you say, okay, well, could they have visited at some point since the formation of the planet? Well, yes, that's reasonable. They say, well, now you've got a reasonable set. It's like fishing in the edges of the sea at the shore and trying to get a fish and saying, well, I didn't find any fish, or going out on a fishing trawler for a month looking for fish. You're going to find a lot of fish if you take that route, right? You go out into the ocean and you explore, you've got more time, more of that space that you need to explore, and you find what you're looking for. So it's a similar principle. So they say, well, look, open up the time and we might see evidence of that fish, right? We might see there was a visitation once upon a time. So with this kind of the search for extraterrestrials within prehistory, you're moving actually into an area that is seen as academically more logical and more realistic, and there's a much more open-minded approach to that topic. So it's kind of ironic that the ancient aliens, in many ways, not necessarily the show, but the ancient aliens hypothesis is actually more in line with science than the idea of the modern visitation kind of view that, UFOs have arrived, aliens have turned up just at the moment that we have our space age, it does seem to scientists kind of absurd, and I can understand that. But now, if that visitation had happened in the past and there was a continuation of contact, that again would be more reasonable. So with those things said, then we say, well, then is there any evidence of visitation to the solar system, particularly to Earth? Because that's where we're most interested. I mean, that's not to discount Mars, which was once possibly habitable, Venus, which we're not sure may have been habitable. So we could have had visitation in the past. Now, there is some really interesting work by, I think it's the guy's name, Dr. James. I'll remember it, I'll let you know. But anyways, there's a scientist for years and years. He's been looking for ways to uncover any hidden probes that might be in our solar system, right? So it's been his particular focus. So he says, if we've been visited in the past, there might be probes sitting out in the asteroid belt or somewhere monitoring this solar system because it's got life. Now, some will say, well, why would they have come here? Why would anyone want to come to our unremarkable corner of the, of the galaxy? For what reason? Why are we interesting? Well,
the same reason we'd be, right? Yeah. If we knew there was a solar system nearby with life on it, we would send probes. So it makes sense that somebody else, it makes sense that some other civilization would feel the same way. Right. Yeah,
absolutely.
Like why do we go study new insects or new species of primates? Or we're curious.
Yeah,
so intelligent species should be curious. Yeah.
Right, and this is a strange argument you'll find from scientists saying, leading thinkers, particularly TV scientists, they'll say, "Oh, why would they want to come here? That we're just arrogant and we think humans are so important." It's like, well, no, like you said, we're even going to look at the workings of insect communities and stuff, right? So it's a really strange argument to make that another advanced intelligence wouldn't be interested in life that it finds in the cosmos, even if that life isn't doing anything, high tech or remarkable, but it's just interesting. Right. And the thing is that this planet has been giving off a signal indicating the likelihood of life since about sort of 2 billion years ago or so, with the oxygenation of the atmosphere. So this oxygen event is quite sort of clear from a distance. They can say that, okay, something is now producing oxygen in large quantities on Earth, right, on this planet. So this planet is now interesting. Now, if you think you've got a couple of billion years, that's plenty of time for probes to be sent. And that's when you start opening up to a realistic model of visitation. You say, well, so Earth has been interesting for a couple of billion years. You can send a probe from anywhere in our Milky Way galaxy to come here at sublight speeds in 2 billion years. 2 billion years is plenty of time for that, right? So don't need to invoke all these things like wormhole travel or light speed. You don't need to put in any exotic hypothesis to explain that kind of visitation. Just put your probe out there, get it as fast as you can. Maybe you get to 10%, 5% the speed of light, whatever it is you've achieved, maybe faster, who knows? But that would be plenty fast enough because the probe just idles its way, even if it takes 1 million years. It doesn't matter, right? Because if you're just intending to reach there, then that's fine. It will reach there at some point. Maybe they reach very quick. We can be open-minded. Maybe there are technologies that get you to 90.
Yeah, and then there's the idea of self-replicating probes as well. So they might go to one solar system, replicate themselves, go to the next solar system, replicate themselves. That's an interesting idea that I think has some merit. That sounds like a logical way to do it, to explore the solar system.
We're exploring doing it. Again, our scientists are exploring doing exactly that. So you'd have these AI probes that come with the programming to seek out the resources to build copies of themselves. So they might land on an asteroid, they would build another copy of themselves and then send that out. So this idea of expanding out into the cosmos by using self-replicating probes, again, that's kind of accepted as a very logical model. And we've had enough time for the entire Milky Way to be visited by swarms of these probes. So again, there's no scientific argument against the possibility of such visitations. And if you go back to, there was a paper that goes back to 1960, I think it's Robert Bracewell. Bracewell came up with this hypothesis of AI probes, in fact then, so 1960s, so the idea that you would, rather than go yourself to some other far-off system, that you would load an AI onto a probe, and that probe would act as both, kind of a sentinel to watch a solar system, but also an emissary for your civilization if there is a contactable life form there. Because, you may not want to go, 500,000 years travel somewhere. You may be happy to just send out a representation of your species in metallic form, in silica form, that has the mindset of your race and has the information of your race. And you send these things out there as emissaries into space. And so he had the idea that these may well be sent to any viable solar systems where they can basically sit either in space or on a planet's surface, monitor that planet. So if there's life there or life emerging, it would just sit and record. And that if a civilization arises, that these things would be pre-programmed to then eventually trigger a contact event, right? So maybe it's you reach the level of radio waves or whatever it is, and it picks up
Or
this.
a lot of people think it's nuclear. Yeah, like once they've reached
Right.
the level of nuclear. Because
that would be the detect a nuclear event, and it would activate, say, okay, this is an advanced civilization, time for me to make contact. So again, this is a model that was proposed as far back as 1960. If you look at Carl Sagan's one of his early papers about this, I think it was about, he had this view on galactic civilizations and the chances that they would have sent out visiting probes or visited themselves to solar systems, around the cosmos over time, and the Earth could have been visited in prehistory. That he proposed that. And of course, Carl Sagan is like an arch skeptic of the UFO and alien contact field, right?
Yes, yeah, very much.
He accepted the idea, even an arch skeptic, that with that great vastness of time, that there was a reasonable probability that our solar system had been visited, just not today, but in the distant past. So you'll find a lot of the skeptics, they do favor that idea that maybe we're missing something in the past, but they don't accept the current arguments of, let's say, the fringe fields today. So what I found was, with the work I'm doing, so I'd heard this account from, there was a few people involved in Australia, but particularly there was a lady called Valerie Barrow, and she's basically like a holistic therapist. I know often you get woo type people in these accounts, right? So they seem to attract strange stuff. But the backstory is that, so there was, I'm trying to roll it back a bit. So there's an artifact called an Tringa. Sorry, it's called a Tringa. Right, this is a handheld. Normally, the ones that are best known today, essentially small handheld, kind of disc-shaped stones, Aboriginal artifacts called Tringa. Now, there's about 3 different indigenous groups that have this lore about the Tringas, and they claim that these Tringas, that there was an original one or original several Tringa that were left here in the early creation time, that they call the Tringa time or the dream time, and that there were beings here, creator beings, who left some of these Tringa, and that these Tringa were said to be sentient artifacts. That they said the beings had turned themselves into the Tringa so that they could persevere through time, and that they had information and intelligence, and only the high elders would interact with the Tringa, and that during certain ceremonies, and there was such a taboo around them that in many cases it was a death taboo, that if you were to go into the cave where the Tringa was, or you would try and handle it, that you could be put to death or have your eyes kind of blinded and things like that. So really strong taboos, right? It was like an artifact that was considered to be so powerful that people feared it. And yet,
like the Ark of the Covenant.
That's what the Ark. Well, I was thinking about it.
That's what I thought when I heard this story. I said, "This sounds like the Ark of the Covenant."
So again, did they have one of these Tringa? That made me, when I realized the overlap, I did ask myself, could the Ark have contained a Tringa? We can go to that as an aside, because again, but it's clearly there's in terms of the law around it, that you couldn't approach it. It was considered to be dangerous. Only the high priests or the high elders could look after it. It could communicate with the gods, right, or with God. So when you start to put those things together, it does sound awfully like the Ark of the Covenant. And so you have these artifacts, at least one artifact, allegedly. They said they have artifacts. No, say allegedly they're special, right? So you can say they have these things. Are they really special or not? Okay, that's the open question. Now, one of these was found by an Afghan trader out in the outback a few decades ago in Australia. Now, he stumbled onto a cave which had a Tringa in it. Now, in the story I was told, it looked very strange, was kind of luminous, and so took this artifact, and then when was next passing through the Aboriginal community near there, tried to give them the Tringa, and the people were so frightened that they wanted nothing to do with it, because obviously they had a taboo around it. So they wanted nothing to do with it. And so he ended up taking this thing back to, I guess, to Sydney, I think it was. And so for many years, it was just there. And then back in the early 1990s, the family that had it gave it to a lady who had contacts with the Indigenous community and asked her, could she possibly repatriate this to the traditional custodians, knowing it was a sacred artifact and that they felt it should go back to the Indigenous people. Fine. So she took that on to do that and tried to get this thing back to them. Now, at one point, she became very, very unwell. She had, mind saying, liver and kidney problems and was going to be hospitalized. So that obviously got in the way of doing this kind of quest to return it. And so she wanted to find someone that would be open-minded to having this strange artifact, strange artifact left in their house for a bit with all these taboos around it, mystical object, if you like. So that's maybe not everyone's cup of tea, but she's heard about.
I wouldn't want it in my house, I don't think. Yeah.
Knowing the taboos around, I think myself, I do have strange experiences in my life. I would be certainly a little bit hesitant if someone says there's taboos around the artifact and it can be dangerous. But so they found out that there was, through their kind of community, they heard about Valerie, who lived in a house called Tringa. So she took this as kind of a synchronicity. She heard that there's this holistic, open-minded kind of person who lives in a house called Tringa. I've got a Tringa from the Tringa time. So she made contact and said, I feel like maybe you're the right person to ask to just temporarily leave this artifact with. And I will come and collect it as soon as I'm back out of hospital and carry on trying to return it to the Aboriginal people. Valerie agreed to this. And so she had it, it's basically wrapped in paper box. You're not supposed to look on it even. So it's wrapped in paper box. She put it in a box, tried to respect that this is a sacred artifact and put it away in a room in her house. Now, her account is that after some period of having it there, she heard a voice directly inside her mind communicating with her, saying that it was the entity associated with this artifact. And then
That's
went
wild.
on. So this way gets to the woo, the woo stuff. So she had so what we would think of as classically, I guess, a very sort of paranormally type sounding story. So, suddenly a voice talking in your head, it's telling you strange stuff, not far off from the many stories we have of channeling or, that kind of stuff, right? So again, his voice in your head now. Is it yours? Is it not? Okay, we can debate that. But she gets this whole story told to her that there's this prehistoric visitation, that this artifact was left here, that it's now on a mission to make a kind of contact, that there's a lost account of human history, of the planet, that it's aware of all this stuff, and gives her this information over time. Also, she becomes involved with an Aboriginal elder called Jerry Bostock. Now, through a friend of hers, he was driving along not far from where she lives, and they got on a detour, and the lady said to him, oh, by the way, my friend Valerie lives near here in a house called Tringa. And he heard that sound. He said, it's an Aboriginal term. He said, I feel like I should go there. And Jerry Bostock was, he was respected, a playwright, Aboriginal activist, and also a healer, and man of many hats, but he also respected elder. And so he just got that feeling again, synchronicity, if you like, that he should go to this house. And so they took the detour, went there, and obviously knocked on the door. And of course, for Valerie, she's there thinking, hang on a minute. Now I've got an Aboriginal guy at my door. She said she'd never had any dealings with Aboriginal people. Like a lot of white Australians, certainly in years past, she lived very separate to Indigenous people, right? She said she never had any dealings with them. Now she's got this artifact in her house, and now there's an Aboriginal elder at the door. Right, so it feels to her that this isn't normal. So he turns up, they have a conversation, and she kind of feels like on edge that maybe he knows that she has. So she's like sort of blurts out, "Yes, I've got this Tringa and it's in a box, and I'm trying to be respectful." And he kind of says to her, "Well, it's men's business," which is true. Only men, particularly elders, are allowed to have any interaction with these artifacts. So
again, like the Ark of the Covenant, only male priests were allowed to be in the presence.
Right.
No women were allowed to be. That's weird. Yeah.
I don't know why that is. Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Yes. Again, another link there. And so he says to her, "Well, look, you're not really meant to have it. So she says, do you want it? And he's like, no, no, no. She said there was fear in his eyes. He's like, no, 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 I don't want to have it. But he said, but I do think that you should go and meet me down at Gosford at a sacred site down there in a few weeks' time. And we'll see if maybe this entity will make contact there at the sacred site. They do this. And then whilst they're there, they have what seems to be, and again, this is all anecdotes at this point. So they claim that they have this kind of time slip event where suddenly, instead of just being at Gosford, in the forest there, there's a rocky outcrop, the sacred site of Gosford, where there's the Carry On Gosford glyphs. Carry On and the Gosford glyphs is an Egyptian hieroglyphs carved into some walls. So it's very near to that site. There's a sacred site there. Now, the hieroglyphs is a whole other controversy.
Yeah, well, how did that get there?
Look at that site. They can look for the Gosford glyphs, and it's basically there's a rocky outcrop there, which is an Aboriginal site going back into prehistory, which now has hieroglyphs on it, which people argue are they modern or old? Which, again, that's a whole other story. I won't go too far. But so whilst they're at that site, they claim that they have this kind of time slip event, and that this leads them to actually see alien craft. They say there's an alien craft crashed in the water. They can see aliens on the beach. That they're aware that there's information being given to them about a visitation event, about a crash, and about the beings have been there in this distant time. Now that's what they say happened, and so they give an account through the information she shared over the years, basically saying that there'd been a large craft had come here, and that it had been destroyed in orbit. There'd been an initial plan for a colony to be set up, but this craft had been destroyed in orbit by another extraterrestrial group that was already on Earth at that time, and that they had been initially, this is again very strange stuff, so they'd been in an agreement that they would come here and supposedly would colonize, but then they were betrayed. The ship was destroyed by another group. Pieces of it rained down across the sky. A few survivors came down to Earth. That they've been using genetic engineering technologies to modify themselves to live on this planet, and that is the standard way that colonies are set up by advanced civilizations, which makes a lot of sense, because how do you just land on another planet and live there, right? I mean, we're now looking at this. If people want to look at this, you can see it. NASA are exploring the idea of future enhanced astronauts who are genetically altered so that they can better acclimate to both space travel and other planetary environments, different gravities, different kinds of air pressure, all these things you have to take on as real problems for space travel. And this often isn't tackled when people talk about the possibility aliens are here. Well, how are they just walking around? But so this actually it made a lot of sense. These are the kind of details that stood out to me.
That does make sense. Yeah, what if there's
a make a story? They don't really give
especially if it's just a little tweaking, like, what if you find a planet that's almost perfect, but the oxygen level on the planet is only 50% of what we're used to? Mm-hmm. What if you can genetically modify the human genome so that the 50% oxygen would be plenty? Then you don't have to modify the whole biosphere. Your organism itself is okay. And then there's that movie Titan, which was exactly about that. They genetically engineered somebody to live on Titan,
Exactly. Yeah. So this is something that is proposed. Again, this is the early 1990s, when these ideas would not have been common in the scientific world, because we hadn't really gone into the genetic revolution. So it's quite funny for basically, a kind of a holistic therapist, but no real scientific kind of interest, to be honest, to say that this is what they were told, is that they would use this genetic engineering to colonize planets, but that they hadn't had time to finish doing this before their main craft was destroyed. So these beings were struggling to breathe. So some of them were getting burnt by the solar radiation of our sun. Others of them couldn't breathe properly. Several died from drinking water that had bacteria and stuff in it that they couldn't cope with. So they realized they could no longer complete this colonization mission, that it was now impossible. So they came up with a plan B. Again, this is what she was told, that at least she said she was told by this intelligence, that they came up with the plan B, which was to modify an existing hominin that they had noticed was living on this planet, and that they decided they could instead transfer kind of an aspect of their culture and of their thinking and of who they were into these hominins and kind of raise them up so that they would be kind of a stand-in for a direct colonization, that instead that these would be almost representative of these colonists, that they would then transfer their mission across to these hominins. So it's kind of early hominins. Wild stuff, right? Totally wild stuff. Like, amazing sci-fi, great. You can imagine the whole story, blowing up alien ships and genetic engineering. Great movie, but is there any truth to it? So there was a few things that stood out to me in the account. Well, one of them was that there was this enormous AI megastructure type craft that they had traveled in, right? And we're told that they didn't build it; it was grown in a matrix, and it was a silica living AI craft. And that again is quite an interesting detail, because now, of course, we realize that most of the scientists in the space kind of field think that aliens will be our first contact will be with alien AI, not with biological beings. Why? Because we're going to send out AI.
It's more likely,
stuff, right?
It seems much more likely. Yeah,
it seems much more likely. And also, if you look at the work of Dr. Susan Snyder, who's kind of an expert in the AI field, she's got an excellent paper called Alien Minds, where she talks about the potential to have vast silica AI megastructures that are basically floating brains, giant brains. He said you could have a moon-sized AI brain, right? You think of the intelligence of that. So you can have these godlike alien moons flying around.
That's wild.
Really crazy stuff. Yeah. So these are not just sci-fi ideas. It's kind of our cutting edge is thinking this is probably the stuff that's out there. So the description of an AI living ship does actually fit with expectations, that you can, instead of having a craft where we just see a metal, and then a computer in it. No, the entire hull is the computer. All of it is networking. So you have this super intelligence that you're sitting inside of if you travel in it. I mean, you don't really need people, honestly, but so you have a super intelligence that is the entire craft. And this is kind of what's described. And so this is then destroyed, and the material is said to have melted and rained down across the earth. Well, I thought, well, if this is real, that material could potentially have survived, right? And it'd be a melted silica type material, highly silica. Okay, so I'm thinking, well, that's one thing I can check. Now, there was another aspect that stood out, was that they claimed that a few years after this, that there was a kind of a follow-up mission, and that involved an enforcement of the original agreement. And they said that they ended up bombarding bases of this other intelligence, and that they used redirected asteroids. Well, that sounds pretty wacky and wild. I'm like, well, that's got to leave some kind of traces, right? Bombarding Earth with asteroids. Yeah, you'd think. So I think, well, that's quite a major claim as a detail. So I'm thinking, well, I can check that. I can see if that's real. And then the third thing that really stood out was, of course, the claim of genetic engineering. I think, well, we've got the genome now mapped, right?
Yeah, I've often wondered about that, because there's just some things that don't make sense about our evolution. But then I would think that I know that the explanation to a lot of people is all the junk DNA, but I would think that all the geneticists on Earth would be able to show or see signs of tinkering somehow in our distant past, and we don't really see that, or at least most mainstream geneticists. I don't think they want to talk about that. They just explain away what we don't understand yet. But yes, because it seems extraordinary that we went from living in caves and fighting with sticks to really advanced architecture almost overnight. It's that's what's tantalizing about these explanations, because people want answers, right, Bruce? Like, I want to know what the hell happened. That a lot of people think it might have been drugs. It might have been the stoned ape theory. Like, maybe we discovered mushrooms and that expanded our consciousness and our mind, and we figured out language and all these other things. There's just so many mysteries. And I think people are hungry. Yeah. Like, this fills in the gaps. Like, oh, that's what happened. That's what happened. Aliens did it. They messed with us.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be careful, of course, is that, you can fall into what's called like the God of the gaps kind of argument, where if you look at the creationists, so you've got creationist scientists who's within the alien, the intelligent design field, who would say, well, there's clearly evidence of intelligence behind the emergence of humans. Ergo, what is this intelligence? Well, God, right? That God intervened and made humans perfect, right? Reached in using miraculous powers and made humans. Or they may not say that. And a lot of times you'll find with ID people, they'll say, no, well, the science, we're just totally, we're being just open-minded to what it was, but there's clear signs of intelligence. But if you ask them to look at it as being potentially aliens, no, it's not aliens. What they really mean is they think it's God. They don't want to say God, right? So a lot of times they're just cloaking that. But so most of the ID field is about God. Okay, so but then most of the other science will say, well, this is just God of the gaps. You're saying that basically there's a gap in our understanding of how modern humans
Fill it in
emerged.
with God.
Ergo, you're filling that gap with God. Yeah. And the exact same thing happens in the kind of ancient aliens field. Yeah. They'll say there's a gap in our understanding, therefore aliens. So we have aliens with gaps.
We don't know how they moved. Yeah, that always bothers me. A lot of ancient aliens theories bothers me though, because it is basically saying we were helpless, stupid monkeys, and we couldn't do any of these things or develop anything like architecture or how to move big boulders around or rocks around. So therefore aliens, it's just too much of a jump to me to go that way.
Both those fields have that problem, right? So, whether you're filling a gap with God or filling a gap with aliens, that is not seen as a kind of a rigorous scientific perspective, because you're kind of starting the wrong way round. You're saying it's not that the evidence of things have taken me to this, it's that the lack of evidence has taken me to this, and therefore I can just tidy this all up very nicely by just saying, well, God did it or aliens did it. Now, I'm not happy with either of those, right? So the reason why the project I'm doing is very different is I don't start with that mystery and saying, okay, aliens, humans are super weird. There's some weird stuff about our genome, therefore aliens, which is what you'll find in throughout our community and throughout, the ancient aliens hypothesis and millions, dozens of books, right? They're starting with that and saying, well, there's this mystery, and then because there's a mystery, it must be aliens or supernatural powers in something has done this. Now, like a scientist would say, hang on, we don't understand, and therefore we need to look at, the data. We need to investigate further. Maybe we need more time to develop different technologies to better understand this, and that one day we will solve it. Now, that's a better approach, but at the same time, that also is a kind of, I'd say, almost like time of the gaps, that if we're given enough time, we'll eventually know anything. So you can say it's better, but it's still imperfect, because I think often what it really means is they say, we'll just wait and one day we'll clear it up. And there's not really a focused effort to investigate the mystery to the level where you could maybe solve it. So I think that is better. It's not functioning at the moment. I don't see that there is really a concerted effort to answer that question. Yes, we're exploring the genome, but I don't think anyone's really saying, these anomalies, let's zoom in on them and say, what could do this? That's kind of missing. So, I'll come back to these anomalies, but because like you, and I guess most of the people listening, I find that area particularly interesting, how we came to be who we are. And that is part of my project. So we'll go into that in a bit more detail. But just very quickly, I'll go back to say, well, look, I had these three main pieces of evidence, right, to look at. So the claims about a giant ship blowing up, these are kind of major claims, things that could survive time. And again, the time that we're given in this, there's two times that she mentions. And one is about 700,000 years ago. And another account I saw her mention somewhere towards maybe 900,000 years ago. So I'm thinking, well, look, there's obviously some vagary, but 700 to 900,000 years ago, you're claiming there's this visitation from what this intelligence allegedly has told you. So I'll open my window to see, is there a time somewhere between 700 and 900,000 years ago where you find evidence of an enormous silica structure exploding in space, evidence of a multi-directional asteroid impact to our planet, and evidence that something happens to the genome of early hominins? And of course, Stephen, to make this valid, all three of those have to line up in time. Otherwise, you're just cherry picking, right? If I say, well,
this is where it gets interesting, when you actually find some indicators that these things may have happened. Yeah,
right. It was wild. I'm going to stay straight up. I would not have gone into this project and publicly talked about any of it if I hadn't found convincing evidence for these, at least two of these three things, right? I don't think even just one would have been enough, because you want something substantiating that these events are all real, right? Basically, not just one thing happened. It happens to time roughly in 700 to 900,000 years ago, which is fairly big window. So, I don't think that would have been enough. And because I already was involved I had my Forgotten Exodus book, which is another project I was doing at the time. I put that book out, and that was about human origins, but nothing to do with aliens. And it had, forward from Graham Hancock, and a lot of momentum. I was doing well. I intended that to be a series. And I'm thinking, well, do I really want to pivot to aliens if I've got that momentum in what I'm doing? And it was quite, respected book. There was no the paranormal in it. Even there was, you don't have to apologize.
Yeah, that one was a little more grounded in science and,
right.
history and reality. So you were, absolutely. I can imagine you were a little hesitant to let's throw aliens in the mix after.
Absolutely, after, and you think even like Graham Hancock said to me, because he wrote the forward. He said, you just remember, if you mention aliens, you are handing your opponents a big stick to beat you with. And, because obviously he knows.
Sounds like Graham Hancock, yes.
Right, he gets it. He knows he's had these things thrown at him. He doesn't really like the ancient aliens topic, as you probably know. He keeps a bit of a distance from that, and probably again for that reason, he knows that if you start to even discuss it as a fringe researcher, it does hand the skeptics and more the cynics, a lot of ammo, because then they go, oh, you're just saying aliens did it all. So he doesn't really do that, and it was sound advice, and he was quite right that you've got to be careful if you're going to pivot into that, because it's definitely a more of a narrow niche fringe kind of topic than just and how did we evolve and the migrations of early humans, which is basically what my book series was about. But there was enough that came up to validate to me that this was maybe real, that to then pivot to it. And I thought, well, this is basically, if it is real, it's like the most important story that I could ever be involved in my life, right? The possibility of actually a real visitation in prehistory, and not only that, but traces of it. And on top of that, the possibility there was an intervention in our origins. I'm thinking, well, it's, although uncomfortable to be speaking about or to put out there as a serious thing, it's so important that if it is real, it has to be examined by a wider world, and at least looked at and assessed, is this just coincidence and fancy, or is there really something to this? So what I found is, long story short, I found that there was an event involving melted silica debris raining down across the planet. And it's dated now to 788,000 years ago. And that's the Australasian tektite strewn field event. Right?
I've heard of this.
So that's dated to 788,000 years ago. So anyone can look that up. You can look at tektites and you can buy them online. I have some. Now, the second thing that I found was that in 2016, a German geological team uncovered evidence of a global asteroid bombardment. And the dating on it, 770 to 790,000 years ago. So that other date is nicely in that frame. Right, so and they also do say they think that it's timed at the same time as the Australasian tektite event. So you've got at the same time this raining of silica debris and a multiple direction asteroid impact event, which is an unlikely event, because when we have an impact, large impacts are rare.
Both of those at once, and so
both
I guess
of them,
So the theory is that the silica debris was not natural then. It was from an orbiting huge spaceship. Is that the theory?
Right. So in the current view, tektites are anomalous, poorly understood anomalous material, but the hypothesis is that they are the results of some kind of unusual asteroid impact events, right? So my argument obviously is completely different to that. I'm saying that this Australasian tektite event is silica debris from the AI craft. And this event is very strange. Like there's been 130 years of investigation into the Australasian tektite mystery, and it is considered a mystery. And you've had all sorts of hypotheses thrown at it, things for like an antimatter event, a comet event, moon rock being blasted off from the moon from a volcano, super volcanoes on Earth. So for years and years and years, all kinds of scientists have thrown themselves at this mystery. They say, how do you end up with, and I'll just give you some interesting stats here. You've got Australasian tektite is found on about 30% of the Earth's surface. Now, you think of that, that's enormous. That's an enormous debris field. And they know that it rains down from space. So at least a portion of it has to rain down from space because the morphology of the debris has very clearly been through what's called a double melting event. There was an initial heating event that produces the molten silica, and there's a secondary reheating as it traveled through the atmosphere, and it shapes it into what's called tektite buttons, and they look like the front of a bullet or front of a nose cone, and they're very clearly shaped by entering our atmosphere. They have to have entered our atmosphere almost horizontal to the plane of the Earth. So they're a very gentle angle of entry. In other words, exactly what you get when something fragments in orbit. You don't see this when asteroids come in from space. They come in at super high speeds, usually steep angles. You get a molten surface that boils off, and you just get these jagged pieces of rock. I'm sure everyone's seen, what asteroid fragments look like. They don't look like this.
Yeah.
Right? These look totally different. And that's because of this shaping in the upper atmosphere. And so there's a number of hypotheses as to how this could happen, but none of them have been, I would say, fully validated. And so the mystery continues. There's a number of very, dedicated tektite researchers with a wide range of hypotheses around exactly how this event happens. The leading hypothesis is some kind of impact in Southeast Asia, probably in Laos, basically in Indochina, and that this event is so kind of powerful, it manages to not only melt the material, but blows material out into space, and that this material then in space somehow enters into this orbital path and rains down all the way across Australia and onto Antarctica, right? And there's problems with this, but anyway, that's the basics of the current hypothesis. There used to be another popular hypothesis, which was the lunar origin, and that was the idea that there was an impact on the moon into a lunar volcano, and that this glass already existed as volcanic glass on the moon, and it was blown into space and then traveled across the distance of the Earth where it rained down. Right, the lunar hypothesis was eventually discarded because we went to the moon. We found that the lunar rock wasn't the right kind of composition. Also, there was some great scholars who kind of argued that, well, a big cloud of debris would just break up in space. It'd be pulled towards the sun. It would never rain down in the way that we see from this debris field. It would be all over one side of the planet. And if it was just in chunks, it would just break up and have a very small area instead when it arrived. So it just doesn't fit. So there was a few major problems. So eventually the guys who were mostly NASA scientists, actually, who were arguing for this lunar hypothesis, they conceded, but they kind of said, well, look, you've still got some really big anomalies and holes in your terrestrial argument that you need to resolve to say that you've really solved this, because simply having one side give up doesn't mean the other side is right. And that's kind of their point, is that we had answers from our hypothesis that were better than yours in some areas, and you had some better than ours, but all of us have holes in our hypotheses, so something's wrong, and that's why it's persisted as a mystery. Now, if you argue instead that you have a glassy, a silica object that's in orbit, and that this object for some reason explodes, reaches superheating, and that debris continues on in an orbital path and begins to fall across Australia and Antarctica, all of the anomalies are basically rectified. Now, I know I'm just giving that as a throwaway statement because I have to give you a much longer explanation of these anomalies otherwise. I have a paper on ResearchGate, which people can read, which goes into the explanation for why it is that tektites are better explained by an object like that. Now, but I'll just very quickly say this. I mean, this is technical, so I don't want to go, I'm aware I don't want to derail people too much just because I've spent so much time reading about tektites. So I'm going to give a very basic.
Give us the clip. Yes.
But I'll give the very basic. One of the main arguments that's out there as to why this is problematic is if you look at asteroid impact glass, and I don't know if you want to bring up some, you'll just see some very standard asteroid impact glass. It just looks like bubbly rock. It's just rock. So when an asteroid impacts and forms a crater, you'll get, of course, some of that rock is turned to gas. Some of that rock is melted to liquid. Some of it is just a bit burned. You get this kind of mix, but some of it forms what they consider to be an asteroid glass. And this glass is exactly the same as the composition of the crater. It's the same kind of rock. It's just a melted rock. It's got bubbles in it where the gases began to release. So you get this foamy material. Now, this is found at asteroid impact sites all around the world. But what you've never found at an asteroid impact site is tektites. They've never been found at an asteroid impact site. There's 4 different tektite types, 4 different strewn fields, and none of the tektites have ever been found in a crater, right, or close to a crater. They found craters they think may be associated, but they're always hundreds of kilometers away. So there's no direct tie-in. And they also say, well, hang on, there's another problem here, because when a glass forms in this way, it is what we call heterogeneous. So if you find a piece of the glass and it maybe was sandstone or whatever, it would still be sandstone composition. You find another piece from another part of the crater that was made out of something else, it will still be granite or whatever. You'll also find that within the mixture, different parts of the rock have different composition, different chemical composition. You also find organic inclusions, which are mud and stuff that's been melted into the rock, other material there at the site. And this rock is very poorly mixed, so they call it heterogeneous and non what's the word that fining, sorry, so there's unfined, it's not fined glass. When you do produce artificial glass, you have a fining process, right? And that removes the bubbles, that you mix it, you make sure it's mixed throughout, and so you'll get a better glass at the end of the process, right? So you do that in a crucible. Yeah, so everyone's pretty familiar with it. You boil the material in a crucible, and over time you release all the gases and volatiles, and you get it to be the material that we use today in windows. So there's a process of fining, and that makes a homogeneous glass. So from wherever you look within a glass window and you test it, you'll find that composition is equal, because it's been mixed and boiled away. And you don't see that in a crater, because these are instantaneous heating events. It's a flash of energy. There's no time for mixing. There's no time for a fining process. You get this heterogeneous material, very foamy and bubbly, full of inclusions, nothing like the glass that we're familiar with in our window, right? We do see a glass a bit like that in nature, and that's volcanic glass. Okay, now volcanic glass forms in a caldera, and it mixes and is heated for a long time, like in our crucibles. Yeah, so it's the natural form of the type of glass that we're familiar with. So we say, okay, we understand how that's happened. It's had time for mixing, it's had time for fining, and so you get this kind of glass that's similar to artificial glass. Tektites are also like that. And so this was a problem, because the scientists had to then think, well, how do you get the time with sufficient heat to have the mixing occur and the fining occur that gives us this type of glass that we see only when there's a sufficient amount of time and energy to remove all the volatiles and allow mixing of the components, so you can find pretty much any tektite from the strewn field and find it's almost identical. And certainly there's very few bubbles in them. You find very rarely you'll find bubbles. Also, you find that they are, again, very well mixed, very fine. So this was a problem, because they said, well, how do you explain this issue? How do you come by a glass that's like that in what supposedly is just a standard impact? And so that's one of the reasons why this persists as a mystery, because it suggests, there's a couple of scientists that made this argument, said, well, it suggests to us that, like with asteroid impact glass, the glass must be like the parent body. So if the parent body is the impact site, the pieces of glass are like the impact site. So if you pick up a piece of asteroid impact glass, it's basically the same as the rock around you at the crater, right? So they say it's just like the parent rock. It's the same composition and everything. So then the tektites should be like their parent object or their parent body, which would mean that it was already glass, already a silica glassy object. That's weird, because you shouldn't have some kind of large find glass object, right? What the hell is that? And what process would lead to it in nature? And why would it be flying around? Why would it end up exploding our atmosphere? I actually saw in one paper, one guy did almost go over the edges of the box in his thinking. He said, well, an object from deep space, something like that, come in, and he's like, but then what kind of object would do that and stop in space and explode? And then they just went back off to other things, because you got to think it's way outside the box, particularly back, say, a few decades ago. when this kind of field
Well,
kind
but
of was really
just to play
ripe.
devil's advocate, I mean, all of these signatures of this silica material could have come from a naturally occurring asteroid, right? Just as well as some sort of technological silicon-based spaceship, right? I mean, it could have come from an asteroid that had high concentrations of this material that impacted Earth.
Well, there's another argument that I suggest, which is probably easier for people to take, which is the idea that could the tektite strewn fields be from interstellar objects? So if you take a step back from aliens, for say, just from interstellar objects, because what we know is in our solar system, we don't have asteroids that have higher than 60% silica, but this material is 75% silica, right? So as far as we know, there shouldn't be anything like that in our solar system. But we don't know about the origin stories for all the other objects outside of our solar system, right? And
Makes
today,
sense.
of course, we now know that interstellar objects do enter our solar system. And then this sort of obviously dovetails a bit with the Galileo project and Avi Loeb, because obviously Avi Loeb has been looking into interstellar objects. We now have a sample set of 4. You know that we have, of course, Oumuamua, that was the first one detected, and that was, an unknown object, a bit anomalous, very strange shape. Obviously he suggested it could be an alien probe, which is kind of funny. The first interstellar object that we detected was weird. It was very flat, like a pancake, and was behaving in ways that seemed strange, like accelerated away when it shouldn't accelerate.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that though. Isn't the scientific consensus that was not any technological, that it was just a naturally occurring, like an asteroid or a rock that just so happened to go through our solar system?
I'd say the consensus is that you cannot determine it, but the popular model is that, it should be or must be just a very strange shaped piece of natural material. I mean, one of the hypotheses was this kind of an iceberg, like a kind of a very strange hydrogen iceberg. There's been a few different models, but I think they all agree that because we didn't get enough data, we didn't directly see it in time, that you can never conclude for sure what it was. And that's why it leaves the door open to say, maybe there's a natural object like that we don't know about.
This explains why he's still selling his book on Amazon, which I've been kind of critical of, because, I think if the major consensus is, okay, it was an interstellar object, but it wasn't technological in nature or any sort of technology. It was naturally occurring material, like a rock or a hydrogen iceberg or whatever the case may be. But some people are still adamant, and isn't it interesting that kind of found its way into UFO mythology? Like, oh, well, that was an interstellar probe and it was racing through our solar system, and people have sort of built off of that. Oh, it was the Blue Avians probe, or it was
I mean, so look, there wasn't enough data to conclude. Like, if someone is willing to say, to stick with the idea that could it be, now he obviously makes the argument that it was exceedingly thin, that based on what data they had, that it was so thin as to be reminiscent of a solar sail, which is a technology that we are building, that you need to
he happens to be trying to build as well and get funding,
which he's connected with. So he's like, well,
no coincidence there.
Well, so there's a strange overlap. So he said, well, it's so thin that we have to be open-minded, so that we know of one thing like that, and that is a solar sail. And so that it could be, and again, these are could-be's because they don't have enough data, so it could be that the reason why it's so thin and so unusual in shape is it's some defunct piece of technology, like an old solar sail that's happened to just be pushed through, and that the sun's energy gave it the boost because it was thin enough to be boosted away. We know that can happen because that's been detected with a piece of debris from one of our own technologies out in space, and it had the same kind of reaction. And so we know that was a piece of human-made material, and it was boosted by the solar radiation hitting this thin material, right? So he says, well, that the only time we know of that effect was on an unnatural artifact in our solar system, something we made. So he does make, he makes scientific arguments for why this could be something like that. Now, he can't dispel the idea that it was natural, because he didn't get, we didn't get close-up images, we didn't get enough data. So the way he kind of puts it is, well, the door should remain open. Whereas the most of scientists will say, well, you've got to exhaust all the non-extraordinary arguments first before you can go to the extraordinary argument. Now, you can kind of debate whether that's fair or not, but that is generally the perspective.
I think it's fair.
Mainstream science. Right?
I think that's fair.
Right. So most scientists would go with that, wouldn't they? They would say, okay, let's see, and that's what the process has been since then, is people exhaustively applying different arguments to say, could it be this? Could it be that? Could it be this? And so we've had a number of other papers since then with people making different arguments for what they think it was, right? But all the other interstellar objects that we know of so far appeared to be natural. Certainly the second one they detected was Comet Borisov, and that was a comet. It was a bit unlike other comets from our solar system. It was an interstellar comet, but it was a comet nonetheless, right? And then they've also detected what seems to be 2 interstellar meteorites that were picked up in a database of meteorite events, which Avi Loeb's team have been looking into. And 2 of these had indications of having come in at speeds that would suggest that they were not gravitationally bound to our solar system. So in other words, they had to
have their own form of propulsion, right?
Well, they have to come in at a speed. No, so they just have to they could be thrown away from another solar system, but they will be traveling faster than the objects in the solar system because they were all locked into the sun, and all these objects in the solar system are traveling within a speed range due to the sun's energy exertion onto them, right? So if you find something traveling significantly faster than the other objects, this has come from deep space. So it doesn't mean they're aliens, but they have a signature of being.
It means they came from it came from interstellar space or another star system outside.
So you've got yes, exactly.
So basically, just so I understand it, they're traveling at such a speed that the sun's gravitational pull doesn't affect them because they're
right. They can just zoom through. Most of them will just zoom through.
Zoom right through. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So we know that now we know that these things are. We know that there's a whole class of objects that a decade ago we didn't know existed. Obviously it was theorized they might exist. Now we know there are interstellar objects. So there are things coming from other solar systems, right? So that in itself is a quite profound change. Now we don't know how often they arrive, but one of the calculations I saw in one paper was they thought that there might be. I think it was. I don't know if I've checked this, but I think that they calculate it was something like maybe a dozen a year, because obviously we wouldn't notice all of them, and we weren't seeing any before, but we know they were there because you don't just suddenly find 4 and there was never any before, right? So in other words, we just weren't picking them up, and so now that the scientists know they're real, we weren't really looking. So once you stumble on one, you realize there's a whole class of objects that you didn't really know about. So then you start looking. Now they realize there's 4 of them so far. And so they've, based on that, they calculated that what there should have been really millions of these over the last 4 billion years, that a percentage of which would go through the inner solar system and therefore may have hit planets, or maybe, still in orbit, or maybe on the Earth. And that, this whole category we now need to better explore of interstellar objects that can tell us stuff about other solar systems. Within that category, of course, is the potential for alien probes. There are some of these mysterious objects that we weren't seeing and weren't looking for. The probes that other scientists have long been arguing should be there if there's alien civilization, saying, well, why haven't they visited? Why isn't there any signs of them? Well, hang on a minute. If we had a whole category of objects that we didn't even see and we didn't know they were there, then you start to say, well, hang on, what else is hidden in that data set? Could there be some of these sort of expected alien probes, which would then answer the other conundrum, the old the mathematical equations on where's all life, how many life, because for years we said, where are all the aliens? But if we're saying now there's a whole category of interstellar objects that we didn't see, then it's possible to say that the aliens may be hidden in our data that we weren't looking at, right? Which is reasonable. So now we've just started on that journey, and of course Avi Loeb has, there's a bit of reflection on my face there, but Avi Loeb has kind of made some arguments for there being possibly a number of alien artifacts that have already reached Earth, right? And that recently they went out to Papua New Guinea to see whether or not pieces from one of these objects might be pieces of an alien probe. And I think you probably saw that story.
I saw that story, but wasn't there a lot of controversy? Right. Like he didn't have the legal right to take those things from where he took them, and There was a lot of controversy about that event, I think, right?
Yeah, I mean, both in how it's been done and logistics, and with some of his hypotheses. I mean, I think straight up, of course, you expect anything in the aliens field to be controversial, which it will be. And anytime someone suggests maybe that they are, well, even looking for or think they have found something to do with aliens, that is in itself going to bring controversy, which I understand.
That's going to be
But
very
also,
sensational. Yeah. Yeah.
right. And then other logistics about it. Yeah, there was questions about, whether or not they should have been taken out of Papua New Guinea. So yeah, there's definitely some other, arguments going on around that. His claims, obviously, some scientists have said that they just don't think that, the data indicates anything particularly extraordinary, that, it was probably just a normal asteroid, even if it maybe is from interstellar space. So yeah, I mean, definitely it's not
Right.
clear.
Don't you think it's still, listen, even if we just take alien technology out of the equation, I still think it's scientifically important to study these objects that come from interstellar space, because they may teach us some things about how elements form in other star systems, or how the elements are different. We hear all this talk about isotopic ratios because the elements form in different ways. I still think it's important. We should, any interstellar object that's coming through Earth, we should try to grab and study, in my opinion, because there's got to be something that we can learn about other star systems from these materials. So even take the aliens, it would be much cooler if it was alien technology flying through our solar system. But even if it's naturally occurring material like an iron meteorite or something, it still would teach us, like, what's iron like in this other in the star system that this object came from. Still important science research to do here. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So the interstellar object, which I find in itself very interesting for those reasons. I think that, you can find a whole new type of material, right, that we know nothing about, that might radically transform our science, because we don't know what we don't know, right? So if some piece of material is ejected from another solar system, and that solar system has a very different origin story, we might find new materials that, say, transform the space age, right? That suddenly you find that this is composed of something that we just didn't know anything about, right? Because we don't have it in our solar system. Say, I don't know, a new metal or whatever, right? And you're like, okay, it doesn't need to be aliens. But just that knowledge, that new find, could transform us in the way that, the first discovery of melting metal changed us, right? That we realized that we could fashion swords and all the rest of it. If you find a new material that has properties that are important to scientific developments, right, that again is a benefit to us. So there can be intellectual curiosity, but also there's potential benefits, and they have found in asteroids in our solar system, interesting materials and stuff that are being looked at, in ways that can be applied to an engineering. So that really happens. Yeah. So that's the other reason why it's important to look at these interstellar objects. But yes, certainly it does open the door to the fact that we have been missing a whole class of objects, and that if there are probes out there, those would, of course, fall into that same category. They would be interstellar objects. So we need to be able to now look very, very intensely at maybe intercepting, being ready to intercept anything like that is detected coming into the solar system, at these speeds, and being able to then find out, what are they natural? Are they unnatural? What's the composition of the natural ones? All of that is, I think, is going to be transformative to the entire kind of field of space science. So it's also gives you that curiosity, the possibility that in the past there was nothing really to indicate that visitation from other solar systems occurred in any sense, even natural sense, right? So now we have the indication, at the very least, visitation of extraterrestrial somethings does occur. Something that not extraterrestrial, but extra solar system somethings. So we have these things that are coming in from other solar systems that will tell us something about those solar systems. And amongst those, we have to be open-minded to the idea that, yes, there may then be probes that we've also been missing. If we're missing these rocks, we're missing these comets, then we also could be missing those probes. And so it does at least open the door now in a way that I think a lot of scientists would have felt that door was closed in the past, and say, well, hang on, if we were blind to those, what else were we scientifically blind to? Okay. So it doesn't mean that
don't you think though that a lot of the over sensationalized stories of like alien crash materials is detrimental to serious work? You know, we've got just so many hoaxes and nonsense like Art's Parts, and you know, you got people collecting millions of dollars claiming we have a piece of an alien spaceship, maybe. And then we find out years later, after they collected millions of dollars, that this was a hoax when Linda Moulton Howe pushed it. It was a hoax when TTSA pushed it. And the recent Arrow report, okay, this is a piece of a missile casing. A little bit of a strange bit of material, but it certainly didn't show any signs of being anything other than terrestrial material. Right? Don't you think all these sensationalized alien crash material claims, because there's been a lot of them, you know, there was another one where it was like smelting material from a refinery, but it looked really strange. And somebody said it dropped out of a UFO. And we've got Gary Nolan and other people. And there's this, the problem that I have is like Gary Nolan's not qualified to do material science, but he's making all these claims and people are sending him material and he's going to study them. You know, it's kind of like a clown show, some of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at with what I said earlier about the SETI Institute, one of the reasons why they were kind of frowned on was because it was almost seen as a, you know, overlap to the UFO thing. Like, oh, here we go. You know, kooky, kooky little green man, and you know, now you're going to look for their radio signals. This is just more of that. And so they were suffering from the stigma of the UFO alien contact story, and that was part of why they got their funding axed, right? You know, there was so much kind of like wacky sounding stuff in that topic that, like I said, Seneca can stand and say, oh, it's those little green men and all that nonsense, and lose them their funding. So they really tried very hard to separate themselves off from the idea of current contacts and UFOs. And to this day, the SETI Institute is quite averse to being connected with any of that for that reason. People say, why don't they look into UFOs? Why don't they look? It's like, well, they work very hard to disassociate from all of that, because unfortunately, whether there's any reality about aliens in those stories, the fact is that there was so little evidence and so much, as you say, like, and there's so much wackadoo stuff, right? That they just thought the better thing is to disassociate completely from all of it and work really hard.
That makes a lot of sense. And just to display, Bruce, how prevalent claims of alien artifacts or technology pieces or crash material pieces are, somebody's mentioning in the live chat, I have some pieces that were gifted to me. Somebody sent them to me, and there's a whole story that goes with it. I've been able to verify that the person who sent them to me's father really was in the military at the place and time that they claim that the material was recovered, but I have little metal bits. But the problem becomes, do you know how expensive it is to get somebody to look? Like, I want to do it, but it's like thousands of dollars to get somebody to look at these materials. And to me, I've shown them to several people, and a lot of opinion that I've gotten back in feedback so far seems to be that these are pieces of a meteorite, a metal-based meteorite. Right. These are not manufactured materials. So I'm hesitant to put the two or three grand in to get somebody to do, a full spread materials analysis on this stuff. But it's interesting that there's so many claims like that. And like I said, these materials, of course, they didn't just come like, hey, here's some material came from a UFO. There's a whole backstory behind this. Maybe we'll do that. I think I'm going to give them to, like alien scientist Jeremy Rise, because those guys at Falcon Space Labs are looking at some stuff like this, and they have the scientific knowledge to sort of at least shed some more light on whatever I have, But no, they're just sitting in. Somebody's asking me, like, nope, they're just sitting in a drawer because I don't have $3 or $5 grand to pay somebody to do a full court, and I'm not just going to give them. Somebody offered, somebody who was involved in alien implant research, who I don't find credible, they offered to do it if I give them the pieces, but I'm like, I don't think I'm going to just give them away. You know, I'm not ready to do that.
No.
Yeah.
Just in case, you know, and, you know, yeah, it's difficult because, yeah, definitely go back to what you said before. Yeah, definitely the wider alien contact UFO field and the stories and what's this is not even just the stories, but what's ended up being promoted as the main stories, right, has damaged the entire field of search for extraterrestrial intelligence, right? There's no doubt that it's done that, right? No doubt that for scientists, you know, it became something they didn't want to be connected with. And again, one of the articles I sent you, a guy called Dr. Milton Wainwright, who's looking for, he's found what might be organisms in the upper atmosphere that may be coming from space, right? But anyway, he said when he first got involved with that kind of field, he heard about Wickramasinghe and the panspermia work that the Professor Wickramasinghe was doing, which he'd done with Hoyle, the astronomer, Royal Hoyle, and that in the past that, you know, they'd become well known for that. So he heard that there was kind of work to be done in panspermia, and the idea that, you know, life came from space and that maybe there's viruses coming from space, you know, quite compared to the stuff we like read about, pretty tame, right? Anyway, he heard about it and he thought this is really interesting. He thought people must be like queuing up to work in this field, to search for kind of, you know, alien life from space and whether or not there was viruses and bacteria and organisms out there. And he said, so he went to kind of apply and he realized that nobody else wanted to do this. And then he started to find out that actually he was like a career killer and that people associate you straight away with aliens, little green man. Oh no, we don't want to do that. And he said getting funding for it is almost impossible. He says, and this is even conventional mainstream kind of academia. There's such a risk averse thing because of the taboo that is leaked over from the public UFO aliens field that people want nothing to do with it in academia. So it's definitely injured the whole field. That, you know, these people are worried that if they say they're in any way connected to looking for aliens, that people start to roll their eyes and think of all those stories of crashed spaceships and
but you know what the truth is, though, that people like you and me who are a little more knowledgeable about the entire subject, I think both of us would like separate the wackadoos from the serious researchers, but some people don't understand the distinction. And, you know, it's interesting. I think the same thing about all these disclosure people. Like I talk to some people and say, don't you think it's detrimental for somebody like Grush to come forward with all these stories and zero evidence? Isn't it detrimental for so-called disclosure that you have some guy and then he turns out to be a former mental patient, you know, and he's literally saying that interdimensional space monsters killed humans, murdered Earthlings, and he has no evidence, and people are still arguing it's classified when it's clearly not, or they wouldn't allow them to talk about any of it. You know, it's just kind of ridiculous. We're at 407 days now since Grush, zero evidence. To me, that takes things back. It's like when people hear about aliens, they go, all these people are wackadoos telling stories with no evidence. And Grush is a perfect example of that.
Exactly. You know? Yeah, this is the problem. You know, people, if you're inside a community, you know, and you have generally a different, well, the majority of people in the community obviously accept the kind of the story and lore of their community. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's paranormal, whether it's the fishing, you know, there are stories within those communities. There's understandings that are not shared with the wider population. So what seems to a lot of people in, say, ufology as being really sensible or rational or helpful would be viewed very differently by the rest of humanity. And that's that kind of situation you've got with like Grush, that because people are saying, well, yeah, there's more of these substantiating stories saying the same thing. It's like, well, yeah, because you can just read these stories on the internet. You can make up your own one based on all the same stuff that's out there, and you can make it sound like it's more evidence for the story. But no, it's just the story feeding itself. Because, you know, if you look at the Jaime Hassan, the Israeli space scientist who came out saying that.
Oh yeah, we covered that extensively, and it turns out that he heard the story from his granddaughter, who heard it from Laura Eisenhower. So people
Right.
think, oh, the Israeli space minister says the aliens are really here. Well, he's repeating stories. It's you're right.
Exactly.
It's mythology.
Same as Hellier, senior
Yeah.
Canadian minister, but he's just getting stories from the same sources that you and I and anyone can access, and that those stories are feeding back on themselves, because then you get someone with, I don't know, like say it was a general or they were a space scientist, and when they say it, it has the credentials, right? So then there's the old, the problem there that you've got this kind of a feeling of officiality to it, but it's the same damn stories being fed back to us that they've read online or read in a book and they believe to be true, but they have no evidence. They've seen no evidence of it themselves. They're just telling you because they believe it. They say the spacemen from the Galactic Federation here, and I know it. And people, yeah, but he's a general or he's a space scientist. But if he's got no evidence, he's seen no evidence.
And we've seen various we've seen various examples of people in the intelligence community that have really wackadoo belief systems. So just because they have those credentials, though, and I often thought it was funny, for 70 years we're told that the government's covering up aliens. Now all of these CIA people are coming out of the woodwork, and intelligence people. We have an infiltration. We have people from the CIA in the UFO community, the DIA, people who were trained in information warfare are coming into the UFO community, or the CIA, the DIA, the FBI. We've got a whole infiltration of alphabet soup people. But to me, I think it's just a good retirement plan for some of these people. Like, let's cash in these credentials. Cash them in.
To ufology. Right. You can cash in. You just retire to ufology. Like anyone with, let's say, senior military or intelligence credentials can come into ufology and be a hero overnight. They just have to tell a good tale, a good yarn, the ultimate fishing story, right? They just have to come out with a big yarn and say that I saw the evidence that you can never see. So you can never, ever.
It's top secret. But I'm going to tell you about it on Gaia TV.
Right. And so that's it. So they've all seen that you can do that. So, and you think of all the thousands of agents and military people, out of them, you're going to get a few that think, yeah, this could suit me as a new career. I'm a bit broke now. I'm in my caravan. What can I do? My clearance has been revoked or whatever for some reason. So I'll go and be a UFO guy. So we have to say that stuff happens. It has happened throughout the whole 70 years of ufology, right? That stuff's been happening. And so now it's becoming better known that, yes, you can just come in and do that. As long as you've got a bit of credentials to you, that you've been in the black world, that you can just say, I saw aliens, or I saw spaceships, I saw TARDISes. You go in and they're big on the inside. All those stories.
Yeah, I love that. I'm I guess you never saw Doctor Who before you decided to tell this story.
Right?
It's kind of ridiculous.
So again, sci-fi feeding in on it as well. So yeah, I mean, look, that stuff has definitely muddied the water for serious research into the idea of visitation. It makes it so hard to bring in people. The other thing is that, Stephen, you know this, that people say we want science. Why don't scientists get involved? Why don't the scientists do anything? And when the scientists come in and have the wrong opinion, they
get attacked. Yeah, look what happened with Kirkpatrick. We want scientific research into this, and we want people to investigate. And then they do, and they say no evidence of extraterrestrial. Oh, he's the devil now.
You have people in your house threatening you and stuff, right?
I wanted to mention, for the benefit of my listeners and audience members, I've put the link to your website in the description of the video or audio podcast if people are listening to the audio podcast later. And also the link to Amazon. You can buy some of Bruce Fenton's books. And I have the hybrid one, but haven't read it yet. So I think that's one of those interesting ones that I haven't gotten to yet. But if you just search Bruce Fenton on... Yeah, if you just search Bruce Fenton on Amazon, you'll find, what do you have, 3 or 4 books?
Yeah, I think currently you probably get 2 coming out of print. I took one out of print because I just didn't agree with it anymore. And I have, but there's 2 you can actively get, Exogenesis and Forgotten Exodus. So the Forgotten Exodus is the one that's just about human migrations, human origins, anthropology type stuff. And then you have the Exogenesis Hybrid Humans, which is the more strange stuff. The other one, Hybrid Humans, is basically out of print. That's probably just someone's secondhand copy. So, but yeah, so there's 2, basically Into Africa and Exogenesis, that are readily available. Yeah, unless someone else is selling my book on there. As far as I know, you never know these days, isn't it, Stephen? People just replicate your work and just sell it and stuff. So I'll have to have a look at that. But yeah, so if people want to check those two out, that'd be awesome. Exogenesis obviously is on the topic we've been discussing, the idea that there's been a visitation. You know, I've been doing more on that since then as well. Done some writing on Substack and talking to people online. I don't know how much time you got, Lex. I should give you a bit of the overview of the genetics, because I know that's what you touched on, saying that you were interested in, as to whether or not.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's do that before we close out. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was going to say, because of course the bit that I think interests most people is the suggestion that possibly that there was not just a visitation, but an intervention, because it's been floating around out there, both in, well, let's say sci-fi, alien concept stories, and a little bit in science for a very long time. The idea that possibly there's been some kind of, you know, cosmic intervention, right? And again, with the ID people and God and all the rest of it, that there's something strange about us. And so what I found with this is that when you time these events, so you say you've got this tektite storm, this really strange, you know, rain of material over 30% of the Earth's planet, possibly from an object breaking up in orbit. And then you've got this multi-directional asteroid event, again, timed to the same point. That the third thing to look at was there evidence of an actual genetic intervention? Now, the funny thing is, because of my work in the other book, I already knew quite a lot about that topic, right? And what I could say straight away was, well, we know that the latest kind of studies on the genome suggest that the ancestors of Homo sapiens, so the transitional species from archaic hominins, so in other words, like Homo erectus, right? That the events that occur to lead to us, they really begin around about 800,000 years ago, based on the understanding we have of the divergence of the ancestors of Denisovans, Neanderthals, and us, and the divergence of all three's ancestor from the super archaics. So in other words, there is a transitional hominin that is the forebears of all three large-brained humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans. There were others, right? But those are the ones we got the fossils for, and we got the whole genome.
This stuff is mind-blowing to me. The fact that there was multiple human species. We know now there was multiple human-like species on the planet in different areas of the world at the same time, and they were vastly different from each other. That's just mind-blowing.
All the large brains, right, that we know of, share an origin in a set of changes in the genome that occur around about 700 to 800,000 years ago, based on the latest understanding. It used to be thought it was about 400,000 years ago. A few years back, they managed to get the full genome of the Neanderthals and Denisovans, and of the Earth. By having that extra information on the Denisovans, they were able to push back the dates. And so now we realize that this event or set of events that leads to all the large-brained humans is occurring again at that sweet spot around about 800,000 years ago, when we've got the tektite debris, we've got the asteroid impact, and now we've got the anomalies that lead to humans. Now, when I say anomalies, you know, that's not a throwaway comment, because again, if there was an intervention, you'd expect to see something anomalous in the genome, right? Not just, oh, humans are a bit different, I think it's aliens. So what we find is that there are a series of peculiar events. I'll give you a quick, let's see, a quick overview of what makes us different to other humans. Now, one of the most well understood arguments is the anomalies of chromosome 2, that we have an end-to-end fusion event in chromosome 2. So in other words, chromosome 2 is two chromosomes fused together at the ends, right? And that makes us different from all the other primates, because we know that, well, they all, as far as we know, all primates that ever lived, they have, you know, an extra set of chromosomes, and therefore, you know, we are differentiated. We also found that Neanderthals and Denisovans, they also share that fusion. So that fusion occurs before the divergence of all the large-brained humans. So again, it seems to be important to the arrival of large-brained humans. Now, it's not the only thing. I mean, chromosome 2 is probably the most thrown out. You see in Ancient Aliens, you've probably read about it in books. It's always thrown out there. It's always so anomalous, and the aliens must have done it. But it's much more complicated than that. There's other things that are really important to making us different to other primates. It turns out that when you look at what used to be called junk DNA, right? But now we know it as non-coding DNA, because it doesn't code for genes, but it does do stuff. A lot of it is actually modulating what your genes are like. And so we have these basically on-off switches. You can turn on genes, turn off genes. It can make a gene express in a stronger way. So they call it these are genetic switches, right? So that's all encoded in the non-coding material. So it turns out a lot of that material is important and it is doing stuff. It's not junk. And that's why no scientists now will really refer to junk DNA, because it's not junk. It's doing stuff. A very tiny proportion is considered junk that they think is just residual.
Or we just don't understand it. So calling it junk DNA,
most of it is doing stuff. Now it was a subclass, right? They found a subclass of material, right, within this non-coding material that was very strange. And this is called human accelerated regions, now HARs. And so these are short segments of code that are so different to other mammals, right? So different in unexpected ways as to be considered anomalous. And so that, I'll give you an example. So the first one they discovered, HAR1, so Human Accelerated Region 1, was a segment of 118 letters, which is quite short, a lot shorter than a gene. And they looked at it in humans, they looked at it in chimps, and they looked at it in chickens and contrasted. And what they found is that between a chicken and a chimpanzee, right, there was 2 letters different. So they got the idea. So basically, that means in 300 million years of separate evolution of those 2 organisms, 2 letters had changed. So you've got a rate of change about 1 mutation per 150 million years. It's pretty damn stable, right? So they're like these segments of code barely change over time. And then they looked at the humans and the chimps, who are supposed to be separate by about 7 million years, right? So the expectation was 0 changes. What they found instead was that 18 letters had changed. So they're like, well, hang on a minute, what's happening here? And
that
then
means
when they
18 mutations took place in that time frame?
Really fast. Yeah, in a period of time where none should have occurred. And so then they started to find more of these.
Strange. Yeah.
Right, so that's what. So they did the maths on this, and they said, really, there's a close to 0% chance that any evolutionary mechanism we understand would lead to that change. And they've since then found hundreds of these segments, so these HARs. And the other thing is, keep in mind, evolution is meant to be random, right? So more or less random. So you'd expect to see a scattershot random subset of these that basically doing all kinds of things to the body. At this point, they think that over half are to do with the brain. And they are doing important things that formed our brain, differentiated it from the other primates. They're like, well, hang on, so you've got these anomalous segments of code that seem to be inexplicably accelerated in their evolution, most of which are due with our strange brain that differentiates us from the other primates. Okay, that's a red flag. It doesn't mean ergo aliens, but you're like, well, there's a very strange something that's happened here, and none of our evolutionary mechanisms we understand currently explain it. If that was so you've got chromosome 2, I'll go a bit more in time. So you've got chromosome 2, which is strange. Like, there's some reasons why that's strange. You've now got these HARs, which are strange. And then in the last couple of years, if people look at the Zoonomia project, they'll see the Zoonomia project basically is contrasting the genomes of different mammals. So they've taken like hundreds of mammal genomes, and they're looking across all of them. And one of the things that they used that for was to see what makes humans different. What is different about us to all these other mammals? Like, we've all been evolving for the same amount of time, same kind of environments and stuff. And what they found was that, again, humans had a number of other important differences. Now, there's another one is H-condels, and these are human conserved deletions. So areas of highly conserved DNA, again, in what was once called junk DNA, in the non-coding regions, again, these what's supposed to be very stable areas. So in the same areas where you find the HARs, they have these H-condels. H-condels are large segments of missing code, where you look across all the mammals, there's this code that's been there for tens or hundreds of millions of years, very stable, and we have big chunks missing. And again, they're like, well,
so that's the argument that somebody tinkered and deleted portions.
Well, you were saying earlier, you should find anomalies, right? Because like you said earlier, you should find evidence of that tampering, real evidence, not like people say, oh, we're a bit different, or it must have happened, but real evidence that a scientist can look at something and say, this is an anomaly that we can't currently explain, but it could be explained by technology. So it doesn't mean you go straight away, that's proven the aliens. I don't think you can prove that, right? But if you're going to start a journey of exploration, it has to start with evidence that might go that way, right? And so if you start seeing changes in the genome that are not in any other mammal and that you can't explain by any understood process, and that you could understand it from an artificial process, but you can't jump straight to it. But you can start by saying, well, now we finally have data that might be indicating that we've had tampering, because we have chunks missing that should be there. And those missing chunks should be harmful, because this was highly conserved code. It's super important. It was doing something really important. How did it just vanish? And they said the other thing is, it didn't just vanish and not harm us. Again, most of the deletions are to do with the brain. They said they allowed functions to occur in the brain that were being stopped by these pieces of code. Bloody convenient. So now you have accelerations where more than half are to do with the brain, and deletions, which are to do with the brain. And right, so then they're like, well, hang on a minute. And then there was a third one, the last one, Steve, why, again, which is a really wild one, which again, in the last couple of years, the team that's connected the HAR research, they've gone on to do some additional work. And what they found was, and again, there's an article that came out, you might just find this, they found that there was what they call a three-dimensional folding event in the genome, where the very structure of the genome reconfigured so that areas of code were touching each other that never used to touch. And the effect of that was to basically differently regulate gene expression, right? So again, if you can find that one, but it's quite recent. So I think they call it a three-dimensional genome folding event, something like that. And so the weird thing about it, again, they said this was really important to differentiate us from other mammals. Again, another really weird thing. They had no explanation for it. And the other thing is, they said this didn't happen over time as an accrual of mutations. It happened in one generation.
Yeah, that makes no sense.
Right, in one egg or one sperm or one fetus, it just happened that the genome reconfigured, and it allows us to have this brain. So now you've got the refolding of the genome, strange deletions, strange accelerations, a fusion event of two chromosomes that also gives us unique benefits and differentiates us from all the other primates. And
this is why it's strange and compelling to me, because you have to look at it from the other side. If you were like, if we were going to take like a chimpanzee and tamper with its DNA to make it smarter, these are the things that we would do. We would tamper with its genetics to make its brain bigger or to make it smarter somehow. So that's why
we took some of the anomalous genes from the humans and put them into monkeys, into I think it's green monkeys, and the brain started changing, folding differently and stuff. So we know that some of these genes that stand out as well as being kind of strange in us, that when you do insert them into the brain started changing. So they do know that, yes, that's kind of how you get it. So, but the other thing is, Stephen, is that this kind of engineering at this level, if someone's doing it, it's so far beyond us. It's so far beyond us that they would have to be on a completely different level, like playing the DNA language, like we'd play, like Beethoven would play a concerto of music, that they know it and they know it. Because if we tamper with these areas of code, we will almost certainly kill whatever we're working on. Because if you think about it, if all the mammals are basically surviving because they have these highly conserved regions that are doing very important things that we don't really understand. If we went in and just started trying to delete bits or change, we wouldn't know what we were doing. We barely understand how those regions function. A lot of them are just discovering, right? So it's as though if someone's done that, that someone knows the DNA code in ways that we as yet cannot fathom. We would almost certainly kill any organism where we changed highly conserved DNA. And as we said earlier, if you think if in 300 million years nature only successfully changed 2 letters between a chimp and a chimpanzee, that means that on every other occasion where there was a change there, the organism failed to reproduce. So it either died or it was infertile, right? So those are profound changes. The idea that suddenly you can have hundreds of these change is very, very strange. Very strange. They'd all be not only successful mutations, but tend to help us. And in fact, more than half give us the brain that has made us conquer this planet, right? That, again, is in itself is strange. It's not random. Random is like, let's say, 10% were to do with your brain, 10% would do your organs, 10% do your body. You'd start
Yeah,
saying, okay,
like why not just make us stronger, instead make us smarter and less
right? Yeah,
physically
why wouldn't it be
dependent,
equal
because
distributed?
we got so smart, we started building tools to do things, and we didn't need such such physical
And it wasn't
strength
even
anymore.
beneficial when we first had that brain, Stephen. Again, this is something that is another mystery about it. They say, well, really, for an early human, your brain is actually a problem because it's really calorie hungry. And we've taken away some of our strength to get to feed the brain. You go into a ring with a chimpanzee, I don't care who you are, you won't come out alive.
Yeah, they'll rip your
right?
face off. They'll rip your
They
face
can
off
rip
and
you
kill
apart. They can just pull your arms
Yeah.
off. So we gave up the defensive strength of our primate relatives for this brain. So we're feeding this calorie hungry brain. And in the early days, we didn't even make tools. You were still fighting against saber-toothed tigers. You still had all that, and we barely had anything but some sticks, right? Stones.
Spears,
Would you trade
sticks and
off the
stones.
strength of a chimpanzee in a time of saber-toothed tigers to have this brain and start? At that time you have no tools. So, but they said it wouldn't
make sense from it wouldn't make sense from an evolutionary. If you just go pure evolution, like we have to survive in this jungle with these saber-toothed tigers and whatever else, lions and bears. We need that physical strength. So it wouldn't make sense that we would evolve away from physical strength and more, at least to me. Yeah. These are some of the great mysteries that it fascinate me. Well, listen, I could talk to you for hours, but I have to get my son off the bus in a little while. We got started a little bit late. I've put the link to your books and also the link to your website and how to follow you on Twitter as well. Bruce is one of those interesting people that is doing interesting work, and also recognizes some of the flim flam and that kind of stuff. And he's at Geological SETI on Twitter, so be sure to follow him on Twitter for more. This has been a fun conversation. I appreciate it.
I think you summed it up. I think I live on the intersection of the woo and the science, and so I'm probably in my own little club there with very few people.
Yes, absolutely.
We don't want just to be listening to total junk, so we want some kind of evidence for things. So I appreciate it, Stephen. It's good to talk to you, and I hope people have got something from all this. We could talk again.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Don't be a stranger. Thank you for doing this today. I appreciate it. You have a good day.
No worries.
All right, friends. What an interesting conversation and lots to think about. Now I'm going to go down some rabbit holes of evolution. Every time I talk to Bruce, he gives me a lot of things to think about. And I hope he's giving you a lot of things to think about. So we're going to wrap things up here. I'm not sure about this evening. We may just call this show, call it a day. We've done our due diligence. I want to take a moment to thank you, kind and generous benefactors we had. And just for those unaware, we read every single super chat and we thank every single person. But I feel funny about stopping the interviews to read the super chats in the middle of it. So generally, when we have a guest, I read them at the end of the show. We want to thank Carmen Burgess for becoming a YouTube channel member. For those unaware, if you become a YouTube channel member during live broadcasts, we give you a big thank you and a shout out. So shout out to Carmen Burgess. We appreciate you. Thanks for appreciating us. We have Modulus J4 with a kind and generous $10 super chat. Says, thanks for being one of the few to expose the current drove of UFO hustlers, Grush, Knapp, Elizondo, Corbell, and the lack of any real evidence in this field. Well, we thank you, Modulus VJ4. Thank you for your kindness, generosity, and support. And we have Legal Eagle. Great show and subject. Thank you, Stephen. Longtime show supporter and member. Thank you, Legal Eagle. And we also have Amy WC says, thanks. I love this guest. And James2488, no message, but a kind and generous £2 super chat. We thank all of you for your kindness, generosity, and support. And thank all of you for helping us to praise the cash. Praise the cash. All right, friends. So we've done our due diligence. I'm not sure. I may be back later this evening, but I may take a very rare night off. My son has been wanting to go to the movies, and it's difficult to do that when I have a show every night at 9 p.m. So Just follow me on Twitter at Stephen Cambion. I will announce whether I'm going to take a rare evening off or be back at 9 p.m. Our next show will be concentrating on the Trump assassination attempt conspiracy theories, because there is so much of that and people want me to talk about that. I've been collecting the material. So I'm not sure when I'll be back, but I will be back for at least 1 or 2 more live shows before the end of the week. We want to thank all of our kind and generous benefactors. We want to thank our excellent guests for giving us so much to think about. Bruce Fenton is like a walking encyclopedia of ancient history and strange things, and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, something that I think is extremely important and that I'm intensely interested in. So thankful to have him back for the first time in many years. So that's all I got for you, friends. Until next time, my name is Stephen Cambion. Good night, and God bless all of you.